I never dreaded war until I heard a human say, "Now it's for real." The station was quiet after the battle. Not the heavy waiting quiet of before. This was a different kind. The kind that came after. Softer, but with weight in it. The kind of quiet where people moved slowly, spoke carefully, and sometimes stopped in the middle of hallways for no reason, and just stood there for a moment, needing the stillness. Ara moved through the medical bay with the practiced efficiency she had trained for years to build. The wounded were being processed. Most injuries were burns and pressure trauma from the corridor push. The collapsing atmospheric passage had been harder on the body than expected. She worked beside the human medics, and they worked well together, falling into a shared rhythm without discussion, the way people could sometimes do when the work itself was clear enough to be its own language. She lost 2 patients. One was human, a young soldier from Rena's advance team, a quiet man named Dayon, the same one who had made the engine sound with his mouth, and who 3 others had turned into a running joke. She had not known his name before the medic beside her said it softly, while marking the record. She found that she felt it more than she expected. She had only known him through the sound of other people laughing. She did not stop working. She kept moving, kept treating, kept marking records. It was what the moment required. Later, when the bay was stable, and the worst of it was past, she walked out into the corridor and stood alone for a while. She found Junho outside the medical bay. She had not expected him to be there. She had expected him to be at the debrief, or in the planning room, or anywhere other than the floor of a corridor, sitting with his back against the wall, and his legs stretched out, and his head resting back against the surface behind him. His eyes were open, looking at the ceiling. The flask was in his hand. He was not drinking from it. Ara sat down beside him. She was not sure why. It seemed like the right thing to do. For a while neither of them said anything. The station hummed around them. The distant sound of machinery, of ship systems, of the ordinary constant noise of a structure in space, doing what structures in space did. Somewhere down the corridor, someone was talking in a low voice. Somewhere further, a door opened and closed. "How many?" Junho asked. He meant losses. 11 total, she said. 7 human, 4 Kreth. He closed his eyes for a moment. She saw his jaw move once. Then he opened them again and looked back at the ceiling. Rena projected 18, Ara said. She did not know why she said it. It seemed important. "I know." His voice was quiet. She worked hard to make it smaller. It was 11, not with bitterness. Just as a fact, the way facts were sometimes important to say out loud, even when they were hard. Ara thought about this. She thought about the way Rena and sat at the folding table with the datapad, adjusting numbers, looking for ways to make the percentage smaller, treating lives like a math problem she believed had a solution. She thought about Dayon and the engine sound, and the others laughing. She thought about Junho writing on paper, reminders to sleep while he still could. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Why do humans fight like that?" She paused, trying to find the right shape for the question. "I have watched soldiers from 6 species in this station. I have read records from 100 more. Most of them fight because they have to, or because they are ordered to, or because they have decided to be brave about a thing they do not want to do." She looked at him. "You fight like you have already decided to pay any price. Like it was settled a long time ago, and the only thing left is to do it. Why?" Junho was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the flask in his hands, turning it slowly. When he spoke, his voice was the kind of quiet that was not soft, the kind that was just reduced to what was necessary. "Because someone has to," he said, and we stopped pretending that someone wouldn't be us. Ara sat with that. "That sounds exhausting," she said. He made a short sound that was almost a laugh, but didn't quite get there. "It is," he said. "It really is." She thought about the silence that had come over the human wing 14 days ago. The way they had gone quiet, not with fear, but with the weight of people who had looked at a hard thing directly and decided. She thought about Rena's eyes when she said it's not real yet. The particular steadiness of it, the door that had shut and locked and would stay that way. When does it stop being real? She asked. The way it is now. When does it go back to before? Junho thought about that for a while. It doesn't exactly. It just gets smaller. You carry it differently. He glanced at her. You learn where to put it so it doesn't take up the whole room. Ara nodded slowly. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Down. The one who... I know, Junho said. I know. They sat for a while longer. The corridor stayed quiet. Nobody passed. Eventually Ara stood. She had more work to do. Post-engagement medical records, a report for the Kreth Medical Board, a list of supply requests for the next rotation. The practical machinery of the aftermath. She looked down at Junho for a moment. He looked very tired. Not in the way people looked when they needed sleep. In the deeper way, the one that sleep didn't always reach. Thank you, she said, because she did not know what else to say, and because she meant it, though she could not fully explain what for. He nodded once. She walked back down the corridor toward the medical bay. She submitted her report 3 days later. It was a formal document, structured and professional, the kind her superiors expected. It covered medical procedures, casualty management, interspecies coordination, and tactical health observations. It said everything the form asked for. At the end, in the section marked Additional Notes, she wrote one paragraph that was not in the standard template. She wrote that she had come to observe human field medicine and had learned something she had not expected. She wrote that she had watched humans face a battle they could not guarantee surviving, and had noticed that they did not pretend it was manageable. She wrote that they were afraid. She was certain of that now. But that they seemed to have made some private agreement with their own fear, long before the moment came, that it would not be the thing that decided the outcome. She wrote that she had never truly dreaded war before. She had feared injury, feared loss, feared the weight of difficult days, but she had never felt the specific dread that came from standing beside beings who understood exactly what they were walking into, and walked into it anyway, not because they had no choice, but because they had made one. She submitted the report. She closed her datapad. She sat for a moment in the quiet of her own room on the station, and she thought about the Vorkai retreating on the display screen, and Junho on the floor of the corridor, with the flask in his hands, and Rena's voice calling casualty counts in the flat, even tone of a door that was shut and locked from the inside. She thought about 11, and what 11 was made of. She did not cry. She was a field medic. She had learned where to put things so they didn't take up the whole room. But she sat with it for a long time, and she never again looked at a war the same way. I never dreaded war until I heard a human say, "Now it's for real." The Vorkai arrived early. Not by much, 14 hours ahead of the projected window. But in war, 14 hours was the difference between a defense that was ready and a defense that was still pulling on its boots. The alarm came through at 0340 station time, and within 6 minutes, every command post on Velkadron was awake and screaming. Davin was at the command bridge in 4. He had slept in his uniform. He had been sleeping in his uniform for the last 3 days. The first thing he checked was the enemy fleet position. The Vorkai had come out of transit at the far edge of the Kel'Moran system, in a formation that was, even by their standards, large. 112 warships, in a staggered wedge pattern, moving slow and certain, the way something moves when it doesn't expect to be stopped. The fleet signature was enormous. It flooded the sensors. The second thing he checked was the human battalion status. They were already moving. He did not know how they had gotten the alert before his own systems flagged it. He did not ask. There was no time. Through the bridge windows he could see the launch bay below, and the human fighters were already rolling out, not scrambling, not rushing, but moving with that steady, deliberate speed that was somehow faster than hurrying. Rena's voice was already on the command channel, calling coordinates, her voice flat and even, as if she were reading from a prepared list, which she probably was. "Rena," Davon pressed into the channel. "The Vorkai came early." "I know," she said. "We are not in position." "We're aware, Commander. Junho has a new approach. Give us the channel." Davon gave them the channel. What followed was the most confusing 2 hours of his military career. He had once fought a battle inside an active gas cloud while partially blind in one eye. Junho's voice came through command, calm and quick, and he laid out the revised assault plan in under 3 minutes. It was not the plan High Command had approved. It was not the plan that made logical sense on paper. It was a 3-flank counter-assault that required the human pilots to fly a curved intercept path that Davon's tactical officer called, loudly and without apology, suicidal. It required the ground teams to advance through an atmospheric corridor in Kelmaran's upper orbit that was actively collapsing from Vorkai weapon fire. It required perfect timing between units that were not yet in full communication range. "This plan requires things that cannot be done," Davon's officer said. "They think it can," Davon said, and he did not know why he was defending it. Only that the silence of the last 3 days was still sitting in the back of his mind like a stone, and that whatever those 41 people had decided in the quiet of their own heads, they had decided it completely. The battle opened. The human fighters went in first. Davon watched them on the tracking display. Small bright points moving through the red mass of the Vorkai formation. They flew in patterns he had never seen before. Not evasion patterns, not attack runs, something else, something that looked almost random until he watched it for long enough and began to understand that it was not random at all. They were making the Vorkai gunners adjust, constantly, never giving them a stable target, threading through the fire with a focus that looked like arrogance until it started working. 3 ships went down in the first 12 minutes. 3 out of the 18 human pilots who had entered the engagement. Davon heard the losses called on the channel and braced for the response, the hesitation, the regrouping, the moment where a unit absorbed a hit and needed time to breathe. The human fighters did not breathe. They adjusted, closed the gaps, and kept moving. Below, on the ground corridor, Rena was coordinating the advance team through the collapsing atmospheric passage. Her voice came through in short bursts, direction, timing, assignment, all of it delivered with the efficiency of someone doing a task that was well within their ability, which it was not. The passage was thinning. The oxygen envelope was breaking down in sections. She was routing her people through gaps that existed for less than 90 seconds before closing, and she was doing it from a position she could not fully see, working from sensor data and the voices of the soldiers in front of her, and whatever she had built in her head from 3 weeks of studying maps on a datapad at a folding table. Davon gripped the edge of the command console. On the main display, the Vorkai wedge was beginning to buckle on its left edge. The human fighters had found a weakness in the formation rotation, a brief moment every 40 seconds when 2 of the destroyer-class ships overlapped their firing arcs and created a dead zone. They were using it. Not every pass, not obviously, but enough. The Vorkai were reconfiguring their formation in response, and Davon recognized what that meant. He had watched the Vorkai fight before. They did not reconfigure. They advanced. The only reason to reconfigure was if something was making them uncertain. Something was making them uncertain. "Junho," Davon said on the command channel, "their left flank is opening. If you push now—" "Already on it," Junho said, and through the channel under his voice, Davon heard something that took him a moment to identify. It was breathing. Slow, even breathing. The kind that someone produced when they were doing something very difficult, and had decided the fear was not useful, and had put it somewhere else for the time being. The push came from all three flanks, in the same 60-second window. The ground team broke through the atmospheric corridor. The fighters hit the reforming Vorkai left edge. At the exact moment, the defensive rotation opened. Junho's own ship drove through the center gap in a straight line that had no reason to survive, and survived anyway. The Vorkai retreated. The bridge went silent. Davin stood very still and watched the enemy fleet signatures move backward on the display. Slowly at first, then faster, the formation breaking apart as the retreat became real. He had studied Vorkai military history. He had read every engagement in the available record. The Vorkai had never retreated, not from anyone, not once. They were retreating now. He sat down heavily in his command chair. His tactical officer said nothing. The other staff said nothing. They all just stood and watched the display in silence. On the channel, he heard Rena call a casualty count. Her voice was the same as it had been during the approach, flat, even, functional. But it was different now, too, like a door that had been shut and locked, and would stay that way until there was time to open it. Davin thought about the paper notepad, the flask of warm liquid, the silence of the last 3 days, and the 41 people who had stood inside it, and decided something that he had not been allowed to see. He thought about the number 18%, the estimate Rena had written with the same expression she wore when writing a shopping list. He reached for his own notepad, the digital one, and checked the loss figures. 11%. She had made them smaller. He set the pad down and stared at the retreating fleet for a long time. Outside the command windows, Kelmaran drifted on, unchanged, the way space always did. Too big to notice what had just happened inside it, too old to care. Davin noticed. He cared. He sat in his chair and said nothing at all, for a very long time. I never dreaded war, until I heard a human say, "Now it's for real." The laughter stopped on a Tuesday. Davin did not know why he remembered that detail. It was not the kind of thing a commander was supposed to track. But he remembered it because the silence came so suddenly and so completely that it felt less like a gradual change and more like someone had reached into the station and turned off a switch. One day the human wing was full of noise, voices, movement, the low hum of people who were alive and intended to stay that way. And then, 14 days after the War Council, it wasn't. He noticed it first at morning meal. He passed through the shared hall early, before most delegates had arrived, and saw 3 human soldiers at the far end of the table. They were eating. They were not talking. Their trays were in front of them, and they were working through their food with the quiet efficiency of people who had stopped thinking of meals as a social event, and started thinking of them as fuel. Their eyes were focused on nothing in particular. They were not unhappy. They were not tense. They were simply somewhere else in their heads, doing whatever humans did when they went quiet. Davin kept walking. He told himself it meant nothing. By midday he had seen it in 6 more of them. A woman named Hyun was sharpening a blade at a workbench when he passed, slow, careful strokes, her eyes down, her mouth closed. 2 others were checking equipment in the corridor outside the armory, talking in short sentences without looking at each other. The kind of talk that was only about the task and nothing else. A young soldier sat alone near the observation deck, not looking at anything, hands resting open in his lap, breathing slowly. Davin found Ara near the medical bay. "Something has changed with your humans," he said. Ara was sorting supplies into cases, and she did not look up right away. When she did, her eyes were careful. "I noticed this morning," she said. "What does it mean?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't know yet. I'm still trying to understand them." That was not a satisfying answer. Davin decided to find one himself. He went to the human wing. Junho was sitting alone in the small side room that had been converted into a planning space. The star maps were open on the table in front of him, lit from below, throwing pale blue light onto his face. He was not moving. He was just looking at the maps. The flask was on the table beside him, untouched for once. His paper notepad was open, but the pen was down. He had stopped writing. Davin stood in the doorway for a moment. Junho did not look up immediately. When he did, there was no surprise in his face, only the slow return of focus, like a man coming back from a long way away. "Commander," he said. "Delegate." Davin stepped inside. "Your battalion is different today." "Yes. Why?" Junho looked at the maps again. The Kelmoran system was highlighted in the center, a small cluster of planets at the junction of 3 transit routes, strategically important in the way that places often became important because too many people wanted them at the same time. The Vorkai fleet markers sat at the edge of the display like a held breath. "In 17 days, people are going to die," Junho said. "Some of them will be mine. Some of them will be yours. The Vorkai don't lose, Commander. Not in recorded history. Not once." He paused. "We know that. And now the time for everything else is over. So, we go quiet." "Everything else," Davin said. "The jokes, the games, the noise." Junho's eyes stayed on the maps. "That's not weakness. That's how we stay human between the hard things. But when the hard thing is close enough to touch, we put it down. We get ready." Davin looked at the maps with him. "Does it help, going quiet?" "It helps me remember what I'm doing, why I'm doing it." Junho tapped the edge of the notepad with one finger. "It helps me stop thinking about whether I'm afraid and start thinking about what needs to happen." "Are you afraid?" Junho looked at him then, directly, without blinking. "Yes," he said. It was the most honest word Davin had heard in this room in 2 weeks. Davin left without saying anything more. He walked back through the corridor, and past the armory, and past the observation deck, where the young soldier was still sitting, with his hands open in his lap. He stopped, and looked at the soldier for a moment. The young man looked up, met his eyes, and gave a small nod. Nothing in his face asked for anything. Nothing offered anything either. He was simply present, and calm, and ready. Davin found Rena that evening near the equipment room. She was going through a weapons check, moving down a row of rifles, with the careful attention of someone who did not trust anyone else's work enough to skip the process. She worked without hurry, but without pause. Every action was deliberate. Davin stopped beside her. "When does it start?" he asked. 16 days, she said without looking up. "Are your people ready?" Rena set down the rifle she was holding and turned to face him. She studied his face for a moment, in the way she had of looking at things. Straight on, not hostile, but not soft either. Direct. "We're getting there," she said. "We're not ready yet. You have 16 days. I know. That's enough. When we're ready, you'll know." "How?" She glanced at him sideways, just for a second, and something crossed her face that was almost a smile, but not quite. "We'll be very, very quiet," she said, and then she went back to work. Davin walked to his own quarters that night and sat on the edge of his bunk without turning on the light. He sat in the dark for a long time. In 40 years, he had learned to read the feeling of a station before a battle. The particular quality of the air, the way sound moved through corridors, the weight of waiting that settled over everyone who knew what was coming. He had felt it hundreds of times. He knew exactly what it meant. But what he felt tonight was different. It was not the weight of an army preparing to fight. It was the weight of an army that had already decided something, deep and privately, in the quiet of their own heads, and had come out the other side of that decision, and were now simply waiting for the moment to move. He did not know what they had decided. He was not sure he was allowed to know. He sat in the dark and listened to the silence coming from the human wing, and for the first time in a very long time, Commander Davin felt the specific, cold, humbling feeling of being in the presence of something he did not fully understand. Outside his door, the station was quiet. Inside the human wing, 41 people were getting ready in whatever way humans got ready, and it made no sound at all. I never dreaded war, until I heard a human say, "Now it's for real." Ara had volunteered to be the observer. She had told her superiors that it was a professional opportunity, a chance to study human field medicine, to understand their triage methods, to bring back knowledge that could help the Kreth Medical Corps. That was all true. But the real reason, the one she had not written in her request form, was simpler. She was curious. She had heard things about humans. Everyone had heard things. She wanted to see for herself. She was young for a field medic, young by Kreth standards, which meant she was 43 years old and had only been in active service for 8 years. She had treated wounded soldiers in 2 small conflicts and 1 full-scale planetary siege. She was not inexperienced. She knew what blood looked like, what fear smelled like, what a person sounded like when they were trying very hard not to scream. She thought she understood war well enough. The human battalion was stationed in the lower sector of the station, in a wing that smelled like metal and something warm and slightly sweet that Ara could not identify. She later learned it was a human food called bread, which some of them baked in a small portable device they had brought with them, despite the fact that it took up space that could have held medical supplies or weapons. She found this baffling. She also found, without meaning to, that the smell made her feel calmer. There were 41 humans in the battalion. Ara had read the personnel files before she arrived. Average age was 28. Mixed backgrounds, various homeworld regions. They had all served in at least 2 previous engagements. Their combat records were clean and efficient, with a language in the notes that was precise and emotionless. Words like neutralized and secured and completed objective, used with the same weight as grocery lists. She met Lieutenant Rena on her first morning. Rena was sitting at a folding table in the common area with a datapad in front of her and a cup of something dark and hot at her elbow. She was not in full uniform, just a gray undershirt and trousers, her boots already laced, her short dark hair still slightly damp. She looked up when Ara walked in, gave her a brief nod, and looked back at the datapad. "You're the Kreth observer," Rena said. "Yes, my name is Ara," Ara replied. "Rena, sit down if you want. There's food over there." She gestured with her head toward a counter along the wall, without looking up. Ara sat, but did not take food. The datapad showed numbers, personnel counts, projected casualty estimates, supply ratios, distance calculations. Rena was going through them steadily, making notes, occasionally pressing her lips together and adjusting a number, then moving on. She worked the way a person worked when they had done the same task many times and no longer needed to think hard about the process, only about the results. After a while, Ara asked, "What are you calculating?" "Loss estimates for the first engagement. If we push through Kelmoran's outer corridor the way High Command wants, we're looking at about 18% casualties in the first 6 hours. Maybe 22 if the Vorkai have updated their flank positioning since last report." She said it the way someone might say the weather was cold today, or that the supply shipment would be late. Ara stared at her. "You're talking about your own soldiers." Rena looked up. Her eyes were dark and steady. "Yes. And you're just writing it down. Like numbers." "They are numbers," Rena said. "I can cry about them later. Right now, I need them to be numbers, so I can figure out how to make them smaller." Ara did not say anything. She watched Rena go back to the datapad and keep working, moving her finger across the screen, adjusting the projected approach vectors, cross-referencing supply positions. She was looking for ways to shave 2% off a casualty estimate. She was treating human lives like a math problem with a solution she had not found yet, and her face held the focused, careful expression of someone who believed, completely, that the solution was there if she looked hard enough. It was the most frightening and the most impressive thing Era had ever seen at the same time. Over the following days, Era spent most of her time with the human battalion. She watched them train, eat, argue about small things, and fix equipment. They were louder than she expected. They laughed often, real laughing, not the polite social sounds that Kretz soldiers made at approved moments. They played games in the evening. Some of them sang. One man named Dayon could make a sound with his mouth that perfectly imitated a ship engine, and 3 others had turned this into a running joke that Ara did not fully understand, but which seemed to delight everyone around him every single time. She kept coming back to Rena. She found Rena in the training room one afternoon, running drills with 4 junior soldiers. The drill was a medical extraction simulation, how to get a wounded soldier out of an active combat zone without losing a second casualty in the process. Rena was patient with the younger soldiers, but her corrections were direct and immediate. When one of them hesitated in the simulation, she stopped everything, made him walk through the moment again slowly, and told him exactly what he had done wrong and exactly what to do instead. No softening, no encouragement that wasn't earned. When he did it right, she told him it was right. Nothing more. When the session ended and the others had left, Ara approached her. "Can I ask you something?" Rena picked up a towel and wiped her face. "Go ahead." "The casualty numbers you showed me, the 18%, does it not frighten you?" Rena thought about that for a moment, not in the way people thought when they were trying to find a comfortable answer, but in the way they thought when they were deciding how honest to be. "Everything frightens me," she said, "but I'm not frightened yet." "What does that mean?" There was something in her expression that Ara could not fully read. Something that existed in the space between calm and tired, between awareness and acceptance. "It means this isn't real yet," Rena said. "We're still planning. We're still moving pieces around. The numbers are still just numbers." She set the towel down. "Ask me when the first shot fires. Ask me when it's for real." Ara opened her mouth to ask what would change, but Rena had already turned and walked toward the door, and something in the straightness of her back told Ara that she already knew the answer, and that the answer was not one that came in words. She stood alone in the training room for a moment. Outside, she could hear Dayon making his engine sound again, and the others laughing. She had never felt so far from understanding a species in her life. I never dreaded war, until I heard a human say, "Now it's for real." Commander Davan had seen war in every shape it could take. He had watched planets burn from orbit. He had stood on fields where the air itself smelled like death for years after the last shot was fired. He had sat across tables from generals, warlords, emperors, and priests, all of them begging, bargaining, or breaking. In 40 years of service to the Kreth Alliance, nothing had surprised him. Nothing had made him feel small. He was proud of that. It was the only thing left that he was still proud of. The War Council was held aboard the station Vel Kadron, a cold gray structure floating at the edge of contested space. It had no windows by design. The Kreth High Command believed windows made soldiers soft, gave them too much time to stare at stars and think about home. Davan had never disagreed with that. Thinking about home was a weakness. He had cut that weakness out of himself a long time ago. The other delegates arrived the way important beings always arrived, with noise, with guards, with the slow and deliberate movement of those who wanted to be watched. The Vorkai situation had pulled in 6 allied species. There were speeches before the meeting even started. There were formal greetings, rank displays, and the usual exchange of ceremonial words that meant absolutely nothing. Davin stood through all of it, with his hands behind his back, and his face like stone. Then the humans arrived. There were 3 of them, 2 soldiers walking a step behind, and 1 man in front who Davin assumed was the delegate. He was not tall by human standards. Davin had studied human physical profiles before the meeting. He was not decorated either. His uniform was neat, but plain. He carried nothing except a small metal flask in his left hand, from which he was, even now, quietly drinking something warm. Steam rose from the opening. He looked around the council room the way a person looks around a room they have already memorized, with calm, unhurried eyes that moved from face to face without stopping anywhere too long. His name was Juno. That was all the file said. Rank, Senior Field Delegate. Species, Human. Previous engagements, 17. Current status, Active. There was nothing else. No commendations listed. No famous battles attached to his name. No quotes. No recorded speeches. No reputation that Davin could find in any database. He was, on paper, completely ordinary. And that was the first thing that bothered Davin. Every other delegate in that room had a story. The Veth representative had survived the burning of Korath. The Keldari general had lost an arm at the siege of Ven Mora, and wore the scar like a trophy. Even the young aide, standing beside the Sorak ambassador, had 3 medals on his chest that Davin recognized from old war records. Everyone in this room had something to show, something to prove, something that explained why they were here. Junho had nothing. He just stood there and drank from his flask. The briefing began. The Vorkai numbers were bad. They were always bad, but this time they were worse. The enemy fleet had grown by 1/3 since last season. They had taken 2 more border systems, and were now sitting at the edge of Kreth-controlled space, with what the intelligence reports described as a posture of imminent aggression, which was a formal way of saying they were about to attack, and everyone in this room knew it, and no one had a clean answer for what to do about it. Davon watched the faces around the table as the numbers were read aloud. He saw the Veth representative's jaw tighten. He saw the Keldari general go very still in the way that experienced soldiers went still when they were doing math in their heads and not liking the answers. He saw the younger aides shift in their seats. He saw fear, carefully dressed up as composure, on almost every face in the room. He looked at Junho. Junho was listening. His eyes were on the projection above the table. The star maps, the fleet positions, the red lines marking enemy advance. He was nodding slowly, the way someone nods when they are hearing something they already expected. His expression was not tense. It was not blank either. It was something in between. Something calm, in a way that felt less like peace, and more like a man standing on the edge of a cliff who had already decided long ago that he was not afraid of falling. When the briefing officer finished, he asked if anyone had questions. Junho raised one hand. How long before they move on Kel'Moran? Current projection is 18 to 22 days. Junho nodded once and wrote something down on a small paper notepad he had pulled from his pocket. An actual paper notepad, with an actual pen. Davin stared at it. He could not remember the last time he had seen anyone write on paper. It seemed almost disrespectful in a room full of advanced military technology. After the formal session, the delegates broke into smaller conversations. Davin crossed the room toward Junho, not entirely sure why. Professional curiosity, he told himself. That was all. You don't seem concerned, Davin said. It came out flatter than he intended, almost like an accusation. Junho looked at him. Up close, his face was older than it had seemed from across the room. There were lines around his eyes, not from age alone, but from the kind of years that only soldiers collected. He looked at Davin the way someone looks at a question they have been asked before and do not mind answering again. I'm concerned, Junho said. I just don't show it the same way. You were writing on paper, Davin said. I remember things better when I write them by hand. What did you write? Junho looked down at the notepad, then back up. 18 days, he said, and a reminder to sleep while I still can. Davin did not know what to say to that. He had expected something more impressive. Something that explained the calm. Instead, he got a man who wrote reminders to himself on paper and drank warm liquid from a flask, and did not seem particularly worried that an enemy fleet was about to tear through the edge of known space. He walked away from that conversation, feeling unsettled. He could not explain why. He had spoken to Junho for less than 2 minutes. He had made no threats, no bold predictions, no dramatic promises. He had just been calm in a way that felt wrong, not because it was false, but because it seemed completely real. Like a man who had been in enough bad situations that he had stopped pretending any of them were manageable, and had moved on to something else entirely. Davin lay in his bunk that night and stared at the ceiling. He had not felt unease before a battle in 30 years. He felt it now, and it had nothing to do with the Vorkai.